now. It's the Finding Your Spine podcast with host Chase Spears.
I remember one young man, a Seaman recruit, who was put in isolation for like 37 days when he was going through boot camp. They would pull him out pretty much only to yell at him, tell him he was the one responsible for the pandemic to continue, and he was the one that was going to kill grandma and all that. And then they would put him right back in isolation. He was given I think it was 1 hour of daylight, outside the walls time a week, something like that. I mean, this is torture.
Welcome to Finding Your Spine, a podcast to call morally principled men and women out of the shadows to put the truth to work in their life, leadership, and workplace. I'm your host, Chase Spears. Inspiration for this series came after years of being surrounded by yes men, people whose greatest concern was safety above all else. I found during my time as a military officer that I was surrounded by people who could recite creeds of warrior bravado, but those same people were imprisoned to their fears of being frowned upon by superiors who had sold out to love of rank and position over their love of country. Their cowardice was a jarring indicator of how far we've fallen since the age of our forefathers, who were willing to risk their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to pass the world's greatest nation on to us as an inheritance. There are a lot of people like me, perhaps even like you, who have seen similar sellouts and who feel the same concern. But I've found that those willing to complain about it are many, while those who are willing to do something about it are few. I, for one, am determined to do something about it. This podcast is a piece of that, and I hope it will encourage you to choose freedom over safety, truth over comfort, courage over cowardice. Today, I get to talk with a good friend of mine who has made those choices, U.S. Navy Commander Rob Green. Rob first came to my mind about 2 years ago for writing this book titled Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. It's a damning indictment of cowardice, lawbreaking, and betrayal committed by senior military officials across the Department of Defense during the military's unlawful COVID shot mandate. As one who is an active duty writer myself, I can't stress to you just how bold a move that was for Rob. He literally had everything to lose for speaking out. A few months after the book came out, I was put in touch with Rob and offered the chance to have my signature added to the Declaration of Military Accountability, which he was spearheading. I have since watched from afar as Rob continues ringing the bell, demanding accountability for over 8,400 patriots who were kicked out of our armed forces for holding to their rights of conscience, not to mention the tens of thousands more who, like me, were persecuted, coerced, and abused as we continued trying to serve under military leaders who had abandoned their oaths. Rob is currently the Acting Director of Global Force Management Individual Augmentation at U.S. Fleet Forces Command. He commissioned into the Navy after graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy. Rob went on to earn graduate degrees from the U.S. Air Force Command and Staff College, the Joint Forces Staff College, the University of Alabama in Huntsville, as well as Old Dominion University. He was recently awarded the Defender of Freedom Award by America's Future USA. Rob is also the founder of Fifth Seal Publishing, which provides a place for constitutionally minded writers to publish books that educate Americans on their rights, empower citizens to fight back against tyrannical government overreach, and give testimony to traditional Christian principles. Rob, his wife, and their 7 children live in Virginia. Rob, welcome to Finding Your Spine.
Thank you, Chase. Honored to be here.
I wanted to start off a little bit by actually reading a section from your book to kind of lay context for some of our listeners and watchers who might not fully understand what it was like in the military the last few years, and to understand the trials that you were really a leader in helping a lot of people to push through and persevere. And I'm taking a quote from page 68. I certainly felt like I was behind enemy lines. I began to think of the entire situation as an operational battle problem that had to be solved. I had given the outcome to God and was no longer particularly concerned about personal consequences, provided that I continued following the law and my own conscience. This decision gave me significant freedom to maneuver as I debated how to begin lawful offensive operations against enemies of the Constitution. Now, this is a very, very bold statement. And so I'd like to go back in time, take us back, if you will, 2020, the world's in COVID. The military is spinning kind of like the rest of society is, trying to figure out what is this thing. And we as service members see the shot coming. We know this thing is probably going to be mandated on the horizon. And so take us back to kind of the beginning genesis of the story that got you to writing that very statement.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you. You mentioned that you're going to start a podcast, and I am just pumped to be able to be here with you as you kick this thing off. So going back in time there's a lot of fear. You remember the fear that was injected into society, the fear that our leaders were putting down upon everybody. We had to do the social distancing, the masking. Everybody was afraid that they were going to be the ones that were going to kill grandma. And so it was in that environment that my wife and I said, we're not going to live in fear. We're going to be bold. We're going to, because we understood that there was more to life than just what we have in the 80 to 100 years that we may have the privilege of getting. We believe in an afterlife. And so, our intention was to leave it all on the table, to do everything we can in this life, to live by principle and not by fear. And so for us, it was trying to let go and let God, not cling so desperately to the tangible things of this world and try to focus on the things of the next. And that's sort of what helped us break through that fear.
Rob, I remember during the same point in time, we didn't know each other early on, but we were probably thinking a lot of the same things. For me, there was a lot of unknown. I wanted to trust my leadership. I know you did as well. You're right that you initially wanted to believe your superiors, what they were saying about this. But you initially grew skeptical, and you talk a lot in the book about how the fact that later on, it was August of the following year when the shot came out, and then Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin mandated it across the force, how they kept saying, well, this is lawful. This is a lawful order. And it struck me the same way it struck you, that if it's lawful, why do you have to continue saying it? There's no other order I've been given in my military career where it was reinforced to me over and over and over again. Hey, just so you know, this one is a lawful order. So can you talk a little bit about how you went through the process of, like I was, trying to trust leadership, but also realizing something wasn't right?
Yeah, so that was a tough one because there was thousands of us that had questions. Things seemed rushed to get to that shot. And, so we had to dig. We dug through the law, and every time we presented something to our leaders, we didn't get answers. What we got was what became almost a prayer. It was a repeated, like a parrot almost, safe and effective. And, this is a lawful order. And so we said, well, what about this law that we're showing you? It says that, it looks like this thing that you're doing contradicts this law. And they would say, don't worry, we were told it's lawful. And no one ever had an answer to any of these questions. And so at that point is when all of our leaders should have said, okay, I'll stop, everybody out of the pool, let's get down to the bottom of this and make sure this is right. No one did that. To your earlier point, no one had the courage to be the one to stick their neck out to say, hey, you know what, this isn't right, or my people have questions. And, there were tens of thousands of service members who filed religious accommodation requests, who had filed internal memoranda that, hey, this looks to be unlawful. That even one of those should have been enough to have leaders pause and say, let's make sure it's right. And instead they pushed on. And that's when we got really skeptical and really dug in. And we began to see a lot of unlawful things happening around the mandate to coerce people to take it.
So within that vein, tell our viewers a little bit about why was it that this was unlawful? Because even though we're a few years removed now, we have a lot more factual data, but there's still a lot of people who have not dug into this nearly to the level that, especially those of us in the military, have. And you, of course, have been chief among them, really digging in, and you've really done the research and really laid it out well. Tell those who might not be familiar why this was an unlawful order, especially if you can talk about the EUA issue.
Yeah, certainly. And if you want to go back to the very beginning to understand how the government found a loophole way to try to declare this lawful and it was clearly completely unlawful and unconstitutional, you got to go back to like 1927, actually 1905, to Jacobson v. Massachusetts ruling, and then you've got pandemic jurisprudence built upon lies that eventually you get to where we are now in society. But if you want to dig into that level, you've got to go to the book. The basics are very simple. If something is an emergency and it's developed in an emergent way, it cannot be forced upon service members. It can't be forced upon any American because they always retain bodily autonomy rights and the right of informed consent, which includes the right to refuse any emergency product. So that's the basics of the law.
And of course, the military was very clearly not following that. I remember I was working in the Combined Arms Center on Fort Leavenworth at that point in time. And this was when the shot was optional. And my boss found out that I had not taken it. He was wondering why I was coming to work with a mask on. And the reason was the general, then Lieutenant General Ted Martin, had put out an order that if you were not getting the shot, even when it was voluntary, you had to wear a mask. It was something to single you out, to shame you. And my boss was so angry at me for not taking it. And I remember thinking to myself, where's your medical degree? Like, what are you standing on to tell me how safe this is? And so I know that those are similar sentiments that you went through and you thought. And I just kind of want to go over some of the consequences not that people like you faced, people like me faced, for context that, really, if you had questions about this, the military leadership really did treat you like a second-class citizen. You were isolated. You were ostracized. You were subjected to weekly testing, treated almost like you were a walking biohazard. I remember on Fort Leavenworth, the director of Army University, Major General Don Hill, said out loud in front of about 1,000 students, if you don't get this shot, you're walking around with a loaded weapon pointed at every member of your family. This is something that is, you have no honor if you don't do this. And so, you write in the book that you knew by questioning, and to be clear, you were respectfully questioning. This was no act of rebellion. This was not any desire to make a show. This was done respectfully. It was done lawfully. But yet you knew from early on that people would come for you, and yet you held to it anyways. And I want to get into what builds that resolve. And we talk a lot about physical courage in the military context, but we so seldom talk about moral courage. And so I would like to kind of go way back in time, to when young Rob Green was a short lad running around the house, learning about the world. How did this character begin to be built into you as a child, as an adolescent, as a young man, as a young military officer? Clearly, you had already done hard work thinking ahead of time, where are my lines? And you knew where your lines were before the storm came. So can you kind of walk us through that journey?
Yeah, I have to give the credit. I mean, the credit's all God's, of course, but in my life, it's really three main people, my parents, of course, and then my wife, who were God's instruments in trying to help me develop that character. I would say that, like I mentioned earlier, it was more a focus on the eternal rather than the temporal. Being willing to let go of the things of this world make it really hard for people to come after you. So when I decided that I was going to go on offense rather than, just play defense, play mother may I, please, may I have my religious accommodation kind of thing, I realized that, hey, going on offense is really the answer here. And so I started, filing, complaints, charges of mutiny against admirals if I could prove the elements of the law that they met, that fulfilled those requirements. And so it really was, hey, I really don't mind. You can send. It was my wife and I, talking about it. I don't mind. Send me to jail if you think you can get away with it. but we're willing to take those consequences to stand for what's right. And, when I think I write in the book as well that it was when I made that decision, I said, hey, we're going to do whatever it takes to stand on principle. How far are we willing to go? Like, hey, all the way. At that point, fear gave way to joy. I had so much fun fighting this, like meeting thousands of people, helping to organize resistance across the nation to what was clearly unlawful and unconstitutional. It was the first time in my Navy career, we take an oath to the Constitution every time we promote, every time, folks re-enlist when we first join. But it was the very first time in my career that I felt like I was truly doing something that actually defended the Constitution in a real and tangible way, and not just a nebulous way of life or, navigation of the seas or, other things. It was like, hey, what's the thing we actually take an oath to? I don't take an oath to, necessarily defend a particular sea lane. I do take an oath to the Constitution. And so this was the first time in my career I felt like I was really, truly fulfilling that oath and making a difference in that oath. And so I again attribute, much of that, or it's all due to God, but much of that, God's work in my life through, both my parents to instill that in me and my wife, who gave me the courage to be willing to make those sacrifices.
And I love that you brought up your wife, because you talk about your wife in your book as someone who was really there to help steady you, and you give her a great deal of the credit. And of course, any sane man is willing to admit that his wife makes him better, and clearly you give a lot of credit to her in this. You also give a lot of credit to a wider community you built. So, can you tell us kind of what those conversations were like, between you and your wife? Because you were clearly both willing to count the cost ahead of time, and you were both willing to pay a price.
Yeah, I'll share one quick story that'll hopefully explain it all in one story. But so we're going to vote in the 2020 election, and we live in a deep blue state. And my wife's sort of hey, we're never going to mask, and I'm not going to mask the kids. We don't believe in it, and we don't believe that it actually stops this virus. And so we live according to our beliefs. We're going to teach our children that, so we're not going to do it. And, of course, they were trying to enforce masks to walk in to vote in person. And we had deep concerns about what they were doing with mail-in ballots, or what they were going to do with them. And so, at one point we're going up to vote, and I'm like, honey, I don't know if I want to go. And I'll just mail my ballot in. And she turns to me and is like, you coward. And so that's my wife. And it was really her, staring down, department store managers and overzealous workers at grocery stores, and cutting down police tape around the playground in our neighborhood, like repeatedly, things like that. I mean, that she was the one leading the charge. And, was it not for her setting that example for me? I'm not really a confrontational person by nature. I'm actually a confrontation avoider by nature. So, you read my book, you wouldn't get that, but that's because it's mainly borrowed from my wife and her leadership.
Rob, it's funny you mention that you avoid confrontation, and I would prefer to avoid confrontation. I don't seek it out. I often find it just in the natural course of living my life is who I am. But I tried to keep track in the book, and just from things that we have discussed in the past of knowing you, for being a non-confrontational person, man, you pushed back. And this is just a list off the top of my head from looking through your book as well. Like, you started off by submitting a religious accommodation request. You went on, and then when the Navy was putting out this order that they wanted you all to sign, you asked them to give you an electronic copy so you could change the wording from "I will abide by the following" to "I acknowledge the following." You filed an Article 1150 complaint against Admiral Grady. Was that a 2, 3, 4-star admiral?
He was a 4-star. He was the commander at Fleet Forces Command. And 3 weeks after that complaint that you mentioned, it was dismissed. He went on to become the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under General Mark Milley. So, and he's still in that position today.
Oh man. Well, I mean, you submitted a complaint against a 4-star admiral. I have not known a single other person in my 20-year military career who's done that. You filed a complaint with Congress that ended up being included in a case that barred the Navy from forcing out a group of SEALs. You created a document that was publicly released called the Whistleblower Report that was put out in August of 2022 that really detailed it to the public the law breaking happening across the Department of Defense. You co-signed that with 8 others. You wrote this book. You spearheaded the Declaration of Military Accountability, which is where our paths first crossed. I don't even know what else you did, but it's really impressive to me watching you from afar at seeing you be willing to take this stand when so many of my peers, they wouldn't have even taken the first step. Maybe some of them submitted a religious accommodation, and I know a few other people who fought, but you really fought well. And you talk about how you built community and how community gave strength, and that got my mind thinking back to saying that you are the 5 people that you hang around. And so within that vein, can we talk a little bit about the importance of, if you're wanting to be brave, if you're wanting to be courageous, surrounding yourself with people who share those values?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a critical one too, because like you mentioned, you're going to be like the people that you spend time with. You're going to do the things that you spend your time doing. So, I would just argue that make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who are principled, and who have those principles properly ordered. And that's one of the issues that we have right now. It's one of the issues that the Department of Defense, one of the mistakes that they made at the highest strategic level, they disordered 2 otherwise good principles. 1, keeping their force healthy, and 2, maintaining a priority on readiness. And when you're willing to put the one of the first one in individual health above that of global readiness, you have a big problem. And the numbers prove it out. You only had 96 deaths allegedly due to the virus itself, over the course of 3-year period from 2020 to 2020, the beginning of 2023. And at that same time, the DoD actively kicked out 8,400 people. So that's what, 8,400% worse than you would have been had you tried to protect the rights of those people and not kick them out. And the same thing for mental health. I mean, they were prioritizing physical health, but not mental health. Over that same 3-year period, remember, 96 deaths allegedly due to the virus itself. They had 1,597 suicides over that same time period. And so, you're isolating people, you're putting in masks on, forced masking to people who wouldn't go along. People were abused verbally. I remember one young man, a Seaman recruit, who was put in isolation for 37 days when he was going through boot camp. They would pull him out pretty much only to yell at him, tell him he was the one responsible for the pandemic to continue, and he was the one that was going to kill grandma and all that. And then they would put him right back in isolation. He was given I think it was 1 hour of daylight, outside the walls time a week, something like that. I mean, this is torture, that psychological torture we're putting people through. And yet our leaders were so blind to this, unwilling to ask questions, unwilling to prioritize people, and their true needs over what they were ordered to do. And, frankly, we failed because of disordered principles. So I would argue that you've got to surround yourself with people that are willing to properly order their priorities, properly order their principles. And that's what's going to best prepare, anybody looking to take a stand and do the right thing in the future. That is what's going to help you do that the best. It's not going to make any of us perfect, but it's going to give us the best chance.
I totally agree. And I'm thinking back to, you just shared the story about that young man who's literally treated like a prisoner. You have a lot of other similar examples in the book. There are other similar examples I could even tell. Like, I remember my very last warfighter that I went to while I was on active duty in the Army. It was in Korea, and it was literally a 3-day imprisonment that we had to go through when we first got there. I mean, put in a 90-degree hotel room for 3 days, not allowed to leave. If you want food, you have to, do a chat thing on your phone and request food or linens or soap or anything like that. And the people just drop it off by your door because you're not supposed to have any human contact. And me and one other roommate were up there in a sweat lodge, and I thought to myself, we're American citizens. And that young man that you talked about, he was an American citizen. And in the military, we swear an oath to the Constitution, as you've noted, and we swear to be willing to lay down our lives and to stand between hostile invaders and bullets and tanks and missiles to defend, free peoples behind us. And yet, in this moment in time, the Department of Defense really kind of proved the adage that at the end of the day, a soldier does whatever the person paying him tells him to do. That military members can be used to quench freedom as much as they can to enable it. And I really identify with one of your earlier statements about you felt like resisting and leading people to lawfully resist this mandate was kind of the first time you really served the Constitution. And that's something similar that I felt in my last few years. I started looking around and saying, well, I've deployed and I've done this and I've done that. But like, how much of that actually saved liberty, right? How much of that actually served the oath that I said? And so that's something that I try to ring the bell on and try to encourage people to think about, because at the end of the day, there were so many military leaders who they said this is about protecting the force. And you make another great point in the book, like, when in military history has everything been about protect the force at all costs? Obviously, we don't want to needlessly put the force at risk, but the military is there to conduct violence on behalf of nation to support freedom. It's been understood throughout all of history that we are going to lose people in the fight. And yet all of a sudden we're hearing we must lock down and stop and imprison people because it's all about protecting the force. I didn't hear anything about protecting freedom.
Yeah, there's something pretty funny. I mean, I say funny. It's tragic, really, but ironic maybe might be a better word. But the Fleet Forces Command put out an official document trying to force everyone to sign it, and the very first thing they had on there, one of the first things they had on there was, your health is the Navy's #1 priority. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, what if we have to go charge a hill or something? Like, what if I need to send somebody, into a firefight to stop a fire on the ship? Like, you're telling me that the health is the #1 priority? I don't know. That's not where we teach our people. We teach shipmate self. That's the priority, when you're on a ship anyway. And so, they obviously got their priorities disordered. And so that, yeah, you make a good point.
Yeah, I remember, just hearing the rhetoric over and over again, and I was a public affairs officer, so military rhetoric was right in my wheelhouse, and I had made a vow when I first came in the military. I will never knowingly lie. I understand there may be times I'm restricted from saying as much as I feel we should be saying. I had to walk that line, but I made a point never to lie, and I remember. And you also point this out in the book, when then Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin made COVID a priority higher than keeping an eye on China. And then you have a great quote from the commanding general of 36th Infantry Division, Major General Charles Arras, saying aloud, "It's not about the science, but about the politics." And I just kept having to wonder, what do the brass think that they're really doing? And are they really this wayward? Are they really this lost? Or are they really just that malleable that they will do whatever they are told to do and say whatever they are told to say and pass down whatever orders they feel that they have to pass down?
Yeah, so the leaders in the military have made a crucial mistake that across all government, a lot of people have made. They put the institution before the Constitution. Mike Benz talks about this actually, in some of his, some of his talks about, what he calls the blob. It's his word for the deep state, really. But he talks about how folks have replaced our constitutional republic with, and our Constitution with whatever is the consensus of the institutions. So, if they come to some institutional consensus on something, that is the thing we have to follow. And that becomes the truth that has to be enacted or becomes the narrative that has to be enforced. So in the military, they have done that as well. They've replaced the Constitution, individual constitutional rights with a priority to defend the integrity of the institution, to ensuring that the institution is not embarrassed. And so that's frankly what they've done. And it boils down to one phrase that I like to use is they put the institution before the Constitution.
Rob, as we kind of try to work towards bringing this in for a landing, in the military, there's a lot that we train on. I remember when people would ask me after I became a paratrooper, how is it you jump out of a perfectly good airplane? And the answer was pretty simple. You don't really think about it. It's muscle memory. You train on it and you train on it and you train on it to where when certain commands are given, you almost just reflexively, your body starts moving, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're there goes a tail and you're in the air, right? And you're not really thinking about it. And we train people to be able to fight with rifles like that. We train people to be able to respond to nuclear threats like that, to where it's just muscle memory. And so there's a lot that we are accustomed to physically when it comes to training. Do you think it's possible to train courage, to train moral courage, or is that something that you just you have it or you don't?
So it was shared with me that, well, first of all, to answer your question, I think it is something that you must train for. It is not something that comes necessarily naturally, because it's a virtue. And like all virtues, by exercising them, you grow stronger in that virtue. It's like a muscle. And when you do not exercise that virtue, the natural opposite is a vice, and you strengthen the exercise of that vice. I mean, the same thing is, with gluttony, is with moral courage, is with, any other virtue you could name. And so you have to practice those virtues in the small ways in order to get strong when it really matters, and you really need that muscle, really need to have to exercise that in order to have it at the ready. And so the story I'll share is an example of that. It was shared with me that in the special warfare community, think our Navy SEALs and our other special warfare types, somewhere between 75 and 90% of those forces all got fake vaccine cards or something like that, right? And historically, I've heard this. I had a hospital corpsman senior chief worked in the special warfare enterprise for a long time. You're like, yeah, I mean, these guys, their bodies are their weapon systems. They train them. They don't like to put stuff in them. They have been avoiding all kinds of shots since forever. And so it's something that was not a big deal to so many of them. But there was a very small percentage of those folks, maybe about 100 of the Navy SEALs in particular, who, like you, had said, hey, I cannot lie. I will not lie. And so they came out and said, look, I'm not going to get it. I can't get it. I know there's ways I could officially get on the rolls and make this not a big deal. But they decided that their integrity was more important than their paycheck or keeping a job or whatever else it was that was being held over their heads. Some of them keeping their trident. That's a big deal in that community. And so that's not a decision that you would necessarily make overnight. if you've practiced the virtue, or if you have failed to practice the virtue of honesty, for example, if you have failed to practice that moral courage it takes to stand out like that, when you're faced with that big decision, and you have such an easy way out that's available to you that your community has used for a long time, that's not something that you're going to make if you've been practicing the opposite vice. So I would say, yes, it's absolutely something learned, and it's something that must be trained in order to have it available when you truly need it.
What are the things that you have 7 kids? They've been watching you through this. Clearly, this is important to you. How are you helping to share these lessons with them? Obviously, I'm sure there's some things you're trying to protect them from, so they're not stressed out in the ways that you and your wife have had to carry stress. But how are you passing this virtue on to your family?
Yeah, so a lot of my older kids are tracking what's going on. We shared with them, kind of the stand we're taking. They understand the world. I mean, I have an almost 17-year-old son, and he's started books himself. He likes to write. He's a big thinker. He's a big podcaster. He works a landscaping job, so he listens to podcasts all the time. Kyle Serafin's podcast is one of his favorites. Good, solid, properly ordered principles. You're always going to hear that over on the Serafin show. So they're learning that. And then as they're younger, we're just, we're teaching them, God's ways. We're teaching them to put their faith first, and everything else, their faith and their duties to God are first, and everything else is after that. And so, you teach them where they're at their developmental level. And, my hope is that your podcast takes off, becomes super big, and it's something that, my kids could, be maybe listening to, daily or weekly at some point in the future. So really rooting for your success in this, because I think you're going to put a lot of great stuff out in the world.
Well, thanks so much for that, Rob. I just want to say as we wrap up here that you have been really kind of a beacon on the rock. I am so grateful, not only for your friendship, but for the leadership that you have given this cause. It has been an encouragement to me. I wish I would have known you a couple of years sooner. That probably would have helped me to borne my load a little bit better. But better late than never, as they say. As we close out, how can people find you, find your work, engage with your work, continue to support the cause of military accountability that you're leading?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter, RobGreen1010. Sometimes I'm more active on there. Sometimes I'm less active. I try to keep my head down for the most part, unless something comes up that's so big. We've got to make sure that we shine 10,000 lumens on it and fight for accountability on things. But otherwise, I try not to get too involved. The publishing company, thank you for mentioning that. No books have been published yet. It's an idea that I hope eventually turns into good literature in the future. But again, I'm still active duty Navy, so that needs to be my focus, and of course my family. So until I'm done and retired and following in your footsteps, then I'll end up just having to focus on the current career. But so RobGreen1010, and then militaryaccountability.net. You can go find the Declaration of Military Accountability there.
Good deal. Well, Rob, I'm so grateful to you for joining us again. I cannot encourage those listening or watching enough. Get a copy of this book, Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines by Robert A. Greene Jr. This has been a great story of a man who has walked through the fire and come out clean the other side. So I encourage all of you listening to go and do likewise. Have a great day.
Remember to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next time on Finding Your Spine.